Good noonish, St. Paul. I'm Mark Ritchie. I've had the pleasure of knowing some of you for a long time and of just meeting a few of you just this moment, but I've had the honor of serving as Global Minnesota's president. And we are so thrilled to have our partnership with Landmark Center. We're kicking off our third year, so this is the third year of events. We'll be back November 13th, the same time, noon-ish, on nuclear disarmament. Lots of interesting things going on in that general category and connections to Minnesota that are pretty special. Today, we have a special opportunity. This whole week, we're partnering with the Sasakawa Peace Foundation, the World Affairs Council of America, which is our sisters and brothers around the country, with the JASM, with the Japan America Society of Minnesota, with the Trade Office. We are part of a larger community of people interested in this issue, and one of the special partners is the East-West Center. It's based around the world, in Honolulu in particular, but in Washington, D.C. Dr. Satu Limaye is our director there, and he is one of the chief scholars who's looking at the larger questions of Japan-U.S. relation in the Asia context, but in the security, our Japan-U.S. Special Alliance. He's an analyst for the Navy and for parts of the Pacific Command. He does a lot of writing and public speaking. And in this week, when we've been having a lot of events and conferences and big meetings and small meetings, he's been a consistent voice asking a kind of interesting question to Minnesotans, which is, wow, there's a lot of great things going on here. What's missing? There's a lot of really good things happening here. What else can we be doing? And so that's the kind of view that I love having as part of Global Minnesota program, is somebody who's bringing us connections to the world, new ideas, advancing our understanding, but asking and being part of a process of us moving forward again. Please join me in welcoming our speaker today, Dr. Satu Limaye.
Well, good morning, since it's still before lunchtime. So we've had a really full time here in the Minnesota, Minneapolis-St. Paul area, and delighted to be here at Landmark Center with all of you today. Look, the Sasakawa Peace Foundation, the World Affairs Council, Global Minnesota have put together this terrific program, and I want to just state up front, I'm kind of the interloper slash pre-lunch entertainment. So I don't know if I will, whet your appetite or perhaps dampen your appetite. I hope the latter. But my job this morning is just to spend a few minutes talking about one person's perspective of the U.S. Japan relationship, and particularly initiative that we have with the Sasakawa Peace Foundation. And I believe it to be a very important initiative. It's called Japan Matters for America, America Matters for Japan. And I'll just hold up the booklet. There's a website that Tim is going to help me. Maybe you could go to the Japan part of the website, Tim. And you could scroll up a little bit so people can see it. And I'll explain very briefly what it is. It's very simple. The goal of this initiative, through the great support of Sasakawa Peace Foundation, is to make accessible to Americans at the national, state, and local level the impact and connections. Now, I've come to Minnesota and I've been blown away by the connections you already have, ones that we could not possibly know on a personal level, and all of the family, historical, and other ties. But I'm operating in the environment of Washington, D.C., and I'll come back to my institution and why we do things like this. And in Washington, D.C., there's a lot of things going on, and you have to compete for attention. And this comes directly to my institution. As Mark said, the East-West Center was established by the United States Congress and is partly funded through the United States Congress in a contract with the State Department Educational and Cultural Affairs Office to collaboratively do education exchange and research to advance U.S.-Asia relations. That's why we're involved in a project like this. So people ask me, why are you doing this? And why are you doing this, Sasakawa? And we directly use this product in order to support the U.S. Japan Congressional Caucus on Capitol Hill. And we work with the co-chairs of that caucus and its membership to constantly educate congressional staff, visitors, the general public, and the media to have a go-to resource on these connections and interactions. So that's all I'm going to say about the product. There is a publication, but to save paper, save trees, you can go to the site and read this PDF in PDF format. And as you can see, it breaks down almost every connection: trade, jobs, sister cities, investment, tourism, direct air flights, by state and congressional district. You can also print out a state page. And so we tag governors, we tag others. So this is meant to be a resource. And I know this sounds odd, but the US government does not have such a resource in the public domain. So we built it. And we're very grateful, of course, to our partners, Sasakawa Peace Foundation, in doing this. And we also launched these across Japan. So we've gone to several cities in Japan because there's a constant need to engage each other on the importance of this relationship, which really brings me to the heart of my comments here. And then really want to open up to questions and comments. So you might ask why you need to do this at all, given what we've learned in Minnesota is such a deep and extensive and historical relationship, whether it's the Sister City program or the direct air flights or the largest collection of Japanese art and artifacts outside of Japan that we got the privilege of seeing yesterday. So in a way, I don't need to explain that. But my basic talking point in Washington is, in my view, in my judgment, as a person who is paid to do this kind of work, and as an analyst in some cases for the US government and the military, the US-Japan relationship is underweighted in the United States and probably underplayed in Japan. And let me try to explain why I think that may be. So if you just look at this year, here we are, 9th month of this year, we've had a new imperial era announced in Japan, the Reiwa era. We've had an imperial succession in Japan. Japan hosted the G20 meeting of the largest economies in the world in June. They're hosting the Rugby Cup through the end of through the fall. And all of that is happening before the 2020 Olympics, which Japan will host. And so it's really critical to sort of see the cycle of Japan. Last time hosting the Olympics was in 1960s, early 1960s. I think it was 64. And here we are at this cycle where Japan is now on the world stage again in a year, hosting hosting the Olympics. And meanwhile, at the bilateral level, we've had these enormous exchanges, right? Someone was mentioning this morning 15 face-to-face visits between President Trump and Prime Minister Abe, 30-some telephone calls, bilateral summits. President Trump made an unprecedented 2 visits to Japan in the same month, both for the G7 meeting and for the G20 meeting and for a summit, including an audience with the emperor. So there's a lot going on in the relationship. And yet, if you go out into the country and if you go in certain places in Washington, the full scope and depth of the relationship is probably underappreciated. Not because people don't think it's important, but we're all looking at other players, and I wanted to set this context of what's happened. There are global changes in the region, and changes in the US and Japan. And an interesting way, I think, sometimes for me to sort of frame it is look at a 30-year cycle. And I picked 30 years for a reason. 30 years was roughly the end of the Cold War, 1989, right? 89, 90, we had collapse of the Soviet Union. We had fundamental changes. So here's things that happened in 1989. China crushed the Tiananmen protests. The Berlin Wall fell. Soviet Union collapsed. European Union set on its path to create the Union. North America just about signed the NAFTA agreement in the early 1990s. Asia, led by Japanese economic growth in a flying geese model. They called it the flying geese, right? Japan is the lead goose. and these countries tagging in the V formation of geese flying into economic development and growth, right? So Japan was going to lead this economic trajectory. So in sum, roughly 30 years ago, at the end of the Cold War, we expected there to be one major power, the United States, democracy all over the world, and globalization. The famous Japanese-American State Department official and author, Francis Fukuyama, wrote a very famous book about it. He called it The End of History. So where are we today? And this is the context and the perspective I want to provide. Today, China has emerged as a power that's challenging global rules, norms, and institutions. It is assertively claiming historical claims to territory in the region, including locked in a dispute with Japan on the East China Sea. The Soviet Union's collapse has not meant the end of the Russian threat, particularly to Europe, but elsewhere, as we've seen. The European and the NAFTA projects are at a minimum in transition because of Brexit and because of our own renegotiation of NAFTA into something called the U.S. Mexico-Canada agreement, which is ongoing as we speak. Congress is considering it in negotiations with the administration. And I think it's safe to say that all over the world, issues of globalization and democracy are in somewhat retreat or on the defensive. So that's the global picture in which we have to consider the U.S.-Japan relationship. The second thing is the regional changes. China, I've already mentioned. But the other thing I want to point out is, in the last 30 years, there has been a remarkable rise of Asia. The relative distribution of the world's wealth, the relative distribution of the world's military power, the relative distribution of future technology and growth has now shifted from the West to something called Asia, the Indo-Pacific region, from India east. So what have we seen? We've seen the rise of Korea to become a OECD member. That's the Organization of Economic Cooperation and Development. In other words, the top 20 or so economies in the world, mostly made up of European countries, right? We've seen the rise of India, which they are expecting in the next 20, 25 years. We'll see how things work out, but to be one of the largest economies in the world with a huge military spending. We've seen the rise of Vietnam from the end of the Vietnam War to becoming one of the fastest growing economies in Southeast Asia, somewhat changing the balance of power amongst the 10 Southeast Asian countries, where Thailand used to be the main country in mainland Southeast Asia. What I'm trying to paint is a picture of profound change in these 30 years. So that brings me to the U.S.-Japan relationship. What is the single biggest takeaway I could leave you is, in this context of global and regional change in this Indo-Pacific region, Japan has had its own challenges, but the U.S.-Japan relationship has, to my mind, fundamentally gotten more connected, more close, more integrated. To be sure, at a relative decline compared to U.S.-China relations, U.S.-India, U.S.-Korea. In other words, the success of U.S. role in the region has been also to create an environment where all these countries have risen. But the U.S.-Japan relationship is profoundly fundamental to that regional order. And we forget, and let me explain some of the ways in which it's fundamental. First, as I said, for all of the difficulties Japan faced with its slowing economy and the so-called lost decades of economic growth, it still remains the third largest economy in the world. I mean, it's quite extraordinary that you could have 2 decades of low growth or no growth and still remain at the level Japan is. Second, Japan's purchasing power parity makes it the 4th largest. Another thing I would mention for Japan's strength is its Human Development Index. In terms of the social indicators personal indicators of a society and its citizens, Japan remains really quite remarkably robust. 18th on the world scale, but if you deconstruct those statistics as we've done, it's actually quite telling because the only countries above Japan are Germany and the United States and others. Other countries are quite small relative to the population. So another area that I've just flagged is the security relationship. We have with us Ambassador Zumwalt, who has been in our State Department and served in our embassy. He's taught me a lot about the U.S. Japan security relationship. But from my own perspective, without the U.S.-Japan security relationship, we cannot operate or work in Asia to protect American interests, not to mention we can't work with Japan to protect Japan's interests. So this is a fundamental relationship. We have basing agreements, Japanese financial and civilian employment support for our bases. We work on military technology together. We do exercises together. And one thing that's increasingly evident in the changed Indo-Pacific environment is we work together in supporting third countries in the region. So, for example, we have a new arrangement in the region called the Quad. It simply means 4 parties, US, Japan, Australia, and India, working together on exercises and sharing information and diplomacy. We're also working together in Southeast Asia to build capacity on maritime forces for other countries in the region. All of these ways are expressing the ways in which the US and Japan are adapting to these fundamental global and regional changes. What other things can I cite? A couple of other things before I turn to some of the challenges. The other element of the relationship is, and I'll just try to really summarize these because you can see all the data and the supporting analytics and the methodology on the website. There is no country in the Indo-Pacific region, and I'm going to say that I'm reading it because I want to get it right because we did a lot of work on assessing this and comparing this. There is no country in the Indo-Pacific region or the world that has the same comprehensive scale, depth, and distribution of importance to the United States inside the United States as Japan. All 50 states and 435 congressional districts have relationships with Japan. Not UK, not France, not Germany, no other country has that depth. Let me just give you a couple. By the way, it works the same in the Japanese prefectures. Almost every Japanese prefecture is also implicated in this way. The U.S.-Japanese relationship is number one in areas such as I said, military cooperation, U.S. jobs created by foreign direct investment. It's amongst the partnerships working in third countries, the key relationship. And it has a connective importance because what the U.S.-Japan relationship does is part of a public good in the Indo-Pacific. It's not just servicing the bilateral relationship, but is seen as a way of keeping the U.S. engaged in the region and avoiding instability from large, growing, potentially assertive and threatening powers. There are other highlights that I could give. It creates more jobs than any other Indo-Pacific country. There is a very high level of public support in both countries for the alliance. The U.S. sends more students to Japan than any other non-Asian country, though I have to say we don't do enough by sending our students to Asia. And there has been, I'm an empiricist, so I look at the numbers. There has been a decline in degree students from Japan, and we need to do something about finding different ways. There's actually been an increase in the number of students from Japan who participate in professional development, short-term courses, and other things, but less in the degree program. And there's all kinds of reasons. People have done serious reports on this. So those are some ways in which I wanted to highlight the relationship. Let me tell you what I think some of the challenges are, just because it would be, I think, unfair to leave aside this extraordinarily strong relationship and tell you what I see as some of the potential speed bumps, or however you want to phrase it, some weather on the horizon. You all know about weather in Minnesota, so I don't need to tell you. First is, I think there's a lot of debate about trade. And the current administration's approach to trade, both at the global level, meaning the WTO, the World Trade Organization, but also at the bilateral level, with a focus on deficits and bilateral deals, has created dissonance in the U.S. Japan relationship. There's no question about it. Though I would note today the president announced that he would be meeting with Prime Minister Abe on the sidelines of the UN meeting next week on Wednesday to announce details of a part of a deal on trade. So we shall have to see and read what that is. Second thing I think that is very close and dear to both US and Japan, but also requires a lot of calibration or a lot of cooperation, is the North Korean missile and nuclear threat. Given the increase in North Korean capabilities on the nuclear and missile side, as you've all read and heard about the tests, we constantly have to work with our partners and allies in Tokyo to make sure that we're on the same wavelength about how to handle this threat. Third is we have to really seriously think about how we operate together in the larger Indo-Pacific space, running from India and the Indian Ocean all the way up to Northeast Asia. That includes issues of how to bring India into the region, how to bring Russia, and what to do with Russia in the region and what not to do. I think we have an important discussion that needs to take place about the Pacific Islands, given both of our countries' interests and historical roles in the Pacific Islands. And finally, I think there is a real struggle because Japan is quite unique amongst Asian players, in fact, unique in the world, in my assessment, of a country that's connected throughout the globe. It has a Japan-European free trade agreement. It is a very close partner with countries in Europe, which we sometimes forget because we locate Japan in Asia, but we forget they have very good ties with the United Kingdom, good ties with France, manufacturing and other economic interests in Germany and elsewhere. So Japan is a leverage and a partner not just in the region, but globally. So those are some of the challenges. But if, again, as I said, I'll end now. I was asked to speak for about 20, 25 minutes. I'm at 20 minutes, 15 seconds. Two things. One, we mustn't underweight and underplay the relationship. I think Japan underplays. In the US discourse, we underweight. Second, we must understand that the relationship between US-Japan relationship is unique because it runs through our society and through Japanese society to the very highest issues of global politics and global governance. If we don't get it right, it was not simply a failed relationship, it will be a problem of managing international relations. If we don't have Japan's support and we work together in the UN, in WTO, in global organizations, with NATO, in the East Asia Summit. So Japan goes beyond just another bilateral relationship. And third, let me just say, from a symbolic and historical point of international relations, the reconciliation of US and Japan is a really important story in the post-1945 international system. It's quite a unique story, and we ought not to forget that story because we can't be complacent about growing apart. We've had very difficult times during the war, and that reconciliation process done by, frankly, by all of you who engage the relationship and by the Global Minnesota and World Affairs Councils who work on this relationship, we can never take it for granted. And so I'm delighted to have had a chance to just share some of my thoughts with you about where the US-Japan relationship fits in the global context and the regional context. Thanks very much. That's a huge question, right? The declining birth rate and the decline of the population in Japan. First of all, I'm not a demographer. I've talked to and consulted. This keeps coming up in lots of discussions about the future, really, not only of the U.S. Japan relationship, but the future trajectory of Japan. I will tell you what I think I've come to an assessment, and Sasakawa Peace Foundation recently had an author of a book called Peak Japan, which puts a heavy emphasis on the demography issue. I'll just state that my own assessment as a non-expert demographer is that I do not believe that the declining population of Japan is as much of an impediment as people are likely to think it is for Japan's future growth and economy. Let me try to lay out why. It's fair to tell you why I think I'm at this assessment. First, because Japan has other opportunities to blunt demographic decline. One is technology, everything from robotics to new technology to make things easier for an aging population. Two, women are getting more and more brought into the workforce. In other words, there's another component of society that is not fully utilized that can help offset some of that demographic decline. It has its own costs because, as you know, one of the variables of demography is the more women get educated and work, the more lower impact it has on birth rates. Third, I'm not sure that demography in its traditional way is the key to growth, economic growth, in an age when we're moving towards additive printing, technologically based, and if you look at the Japanese economy, heavily service-based. So there will be many other places where Japan can invest, manufacture, et cetera. It doesn't have to all be in Japan. Now, I concede that there are points about budget deficits and tax revenues as the population declines, but we'll have to see. But my own assessment is it's a problem, but not a problem for Japan's future growth. The other final thing I'll say is Japan tends to be quite innovative. And so Japan may well find solutions, and we may be learning a lot from Japan how to handle an aging population, how to manage with fewer people. So some of the disruptions that we see could be handled by Japan sort of in a leading edge way. And we'll have to see. We'll have to see. I should mention, and I'm not sure, there are other people who know a lot more about the immigration, but there are small elements of immigration. I mean, is a empirical increase in the number of foreigners working in Japan. I'm not sure it'll look like the United States, but that can also be adjusted as a thermostat or increase and decrease to handle the demography issue. Well, people have explained a lot of reasons to me. They range from the Japanese work culture, graduating from a Japanese university, going straight into the business environment or to a company is part of the consideration. Second of all, as we just discussed on the demography issue, there are fewer Japanese students. By the way, there might be fewer American students too for colleges and universities. This isn't unique to Japan. Third, I do think you hear anecdotal tales of concerns about safety and gun violence in the United States. I think this does matter. Fourth, and this may be cyclical and temporary rather than structural, one of the variables that's been explained is the rise of the US dollar and the cost of education. And fifth, let's not forget we're not the only market for education. Canada, New Zealand, Australia, the UK, I can assure you, are happily competing for those tuition dollars and incoming students to staff their universities, colleges, vocational schools as well. So what is the exact precise mix in a particular year for this decline? We know empirically that it's a trend. We know that it is structural, but how these factors interact with specific declines is unclear. But what I did say is that Japanese tourism has not fallen off to the United States. Japanese attending various language, professional development, short-term courses, other kinds of training, maybe. So we may need to be more innovative in how to make programs attractive. And I'll just say, let me give you, please, I'm also represent the East West Center, so let me just, we have signed an agreement with the U.S. Embassy in Tokyo and the Japan Foundation to bring Japanese Americans and Southeast Asians together for a 3-month fellowship in Washington. That's a program someone can do, right? It may be in between a university and a job, starting of a job. They may be in a transition from one job to another. So guess who we had on our first course? We had a PhD Japanese expert on water resources in Southeast Asia with a PhD from Heidelberg. And we had a young trade negotiator from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. I do believe there is room for such innovative programming. In a way, it doesn't meet the traditional needs of a tuition-based degree program, but they can be quite effective in this new age when people are looking for very quick turnarounds and technology allows them to get to things much quicker. So they may not be interested in a degree, but they may be interested in writing a paper with their colleagues and interviewing people in DC, for example, on their study. So I think it's possible to do, and this is one of the things we're looking at working very much on, is how to engage Americans and Japanese in a different way in the region. Because the other thing is it cannot be bilateral, because Japan is more and more integrated with the region. Regional integration is at about 50% now on trade and investment in the Indo-Pacific region, and Japan is a critical player in that integration. So one of the things I'm going to be discussing with the Japan Foundation in December for one whole week is a group of us have been gathered to look at how we establish new U.S. Japan programs in the context of working in Southeast Asia. And the other area is South Asia. Let me explain why. Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, and India are at the western edge of our traditional American conception of Asia. But if you look at how Japanese investment interests in the Bay of Bengal, and in particular with India, are approaching, there is more interest both on the American side and the Japanese side in linking South and Southeast Asia together. So we're looking at ways in which the US and Japan could work across that seam. They're not good for the United States or the US-Japan relationship. Obviously, our governments have to work together in finding a way to manage, because for those, just context, we have an alliance with Japan and we have an alliance with Korea. There has been, over time, more and more contacts amongst all three of us because of the North Korea threat. In order to be able to handle the North Korea situation, we need to all be on the same wavelength, right? But if Japan and Korea are not cooperating, it makes that job harder, not to mention having two allies not working well with each other, right? But I will tell you that I particularly don't know what is the fine line between America's role in helping and being a good offices or a convener of a discussion between Japan and Korea and being interventionist in that relationship. There's a fine line that only diplomats and our officials kind of have the pulse on because they're in these meeting rooms discussing with both sides. So I think we need to be very conscious, aware, and engaged, but exactly how to be engaged and what to ask for is a little tricky to me. Because at the end of the day, any reconciliation between Japan and Korea cannot be imposed on either side. It must come from their societies, their governments, and their. So it's a very tricky and fine line, I think, where our our platform, our good offices, our convening starts, and where our intrusion or intervention or our pressure ends. And again, I think that'll be handled at the very highest levels, I hope. I'm not an expert on Japan domestic politics, but if I've read the polls correctly before coming here in preparation for just such a question, the overwhelming consensus that I read, and again, I happily corrected on this, is there is not overwhelming public support for revising the Constitution. In fact, there is not terribly strong support for revising the Constitution. Second, it is unclear that that is going to be the immediate priority of Prime Minister Abe. But I think the more, in a way, what Japan does on this is, of course, a domestic issue. It's their constitution, it's their votes, their leadership, their elections. I approach the U.S.-Japan relationship from the region. So I can tell you when I'm constantly in the region. I was in India last week, I'll be in Singapore next week, and in Southeast Asia. Let me just make 3 observations from what I talk to my friends in the region. 1, this is a kind of archaic debate of the U.S.-Japan alliance, whether Japan has a military and defense capabilities or not. Because from the regional perspective, Japan already does have these capabilities, and they're evident in the region through exercises with the U.S., with cooperative activities with other players, etc., including capacity building. Second, there is a remarkable view in the region, given the legacy of the last war, where most countries in South and Southeast Asia welcome a more robust Japanese defense and military and security role on roughly 2 counts. 3 counts. 1, Japan has the capability to help with their own defenses and capacity. They can provide patrol boats for maritime patrolling. They can help training. They can provide spare parts. They can do exercises. Second, a U.S.-Japan role, as I said, is a public good in the region. So the more that Japan is engaged in the region with the U.S., allows more confidence and stability from a rising China. And third, from the perspective of the region, Japan, no one currently assesses Japan has any offensive or assertive ambitions in the region. So for these reasons, quite apart from the domestic debate about whether to reform, most outsiders, they're not aware of these intricate debates about constitutional revision. They already see Japanese destroyers. They see Japanese planes. They understand the limitations about offensive actions and especially government officials. But from their perspective, Japan has a Ministry of Defense. They're called self-defense forces, but they're very capable, high-end, interoperable forces with Australia, with the United States. So I think from a regional perspective, the reality of Japan's military capabilities is already there and won't rest on what the constitutional revision is. Well, the question was, would that also apply to nuclear weapons, which is a completely fair question. In a previous life, I worked on the Japanese civilian nuclear reactor program with its utility companies because they bought low-enriched uranium from us, from our gaseous diffusion plants in Kentucky. So I spent quite a lot of time looking at and thinking about Japan's nuclear. I see zero evidence that Japan wants to change its sort of principles on non-acquisition of nuclear weapons. And I see no public sentiment towards it. I see no serious government debate. There will always be the newspaper media article, so-and-so suggests that maybe if the U.S. is not reliable, Japan should have nuclear weapons. Of course, there will be always, it's a big country, it's a democratic country, it's an open press, so there will be always a story like that. But I see no evidence that the Japanese government is anywhere near to changing its status, that it will not acquire, build, or possess nuclear weapons. And I have, just to piggyback on Sarah's question about the military, I see no evidence of concern or anxiety in South and Southeast Asia about this. Now, the one place where there is anxiety is China and in Korea. I think it must be said that given the unsettled relationships in Northeast Asia, there is less confidence that Japan will not have nuclear weapons. But in South and the rest of Asia, I've never met a government official seriously informed who thinks that's a Japanese trajectory. They see that. And I'll just say this because I'm not a government official. If Japan overtly gets nuclear weapons, meaning says we now have possessed nuclear weapons, your problem, or the security problem, the international relations problem, is not Japan having nuclear weapons. Something went very wrong to get to that state of affairs. I mean, anyone can think of scenarios, right? The U.S.-Japan alliance is gone. China has attacked Japan. Japan is alone. I mean, one can think of 100 ways in which this might occur, the pathway to that. But then the problem is not having nuclear weapons. The problem is started much before that. Something happened that went very bad in international relations that would lead to that outcome or that decision. Let's put it this way. If you went through and I'm trying to look for our graphic on this, on diplomatic support, the United States keeps a record of voting consequence with the United States in the United Nations on key issues, and has historically done so. It's an annual report. You can get it on the State Department website. The methodology changes a little bit. Exact issues change because conditions change. But if you look at, and I think we have a graphic, Japan has one of the highest voting consonances with the United States on key global issues. It doesn't mean we have exactly the same interests or the same positions. For example, on the Iran nuclear deal, we don't have the same position. But the overwhelming amount of support in the international organizations, international trade regimes, in regional organizations, US and Japan agree far more than they disagree. So if you look on, if you go to the website, it's very simple to remember. You go to japanmattersforamerica.org. You can see in all of the ways in which Japan and the US contribute across the globe. Peacekeeping, humanitarian assistance and disaster relief, health aid, collaborating on international assistance. If you look here, we've done a chart of all the international organizations and the relative US and Japanese funding in them. So, are there differences on specific policy issues? Yes. For example, I think there would be some concern in the US if Japan currently got too close to Russia. I think there were raised eyebrows when Prime Minister Abe went to Iran. But he went, right? And that does not preclude, there is no country with which we have 100% total unanimity on about anything. Certainly not with the United Kingdom or any of our other allies. So overwhelmingly, the net pluses in the US-Japan relationship globally and regionally far outweigh disagreements on specific matters and specific issues. Wow, you're asking me a question about Japanese political economy, and I know the basics, which is Japan has a very high share of services to its GDP ratio, which is similar to the US. Second, the US and Japan are similar in that both countries rely heavily on domestic consumption as a share of their GDP. Manufacturing has certainly gone down in the United States as a share of GDP, but Japan is, of course, through its foreign direct investment, hugely invested in the manufacturing sector in the United States. As we point out, much of their FDI produces the largest number of jobs, second only to the UK, which has been around investing in the United States since for a lot longer, 150 years or so. So the Japanese manufacturing center, as I understand it, has been more offshored. So the global production and supply chains that Japan have are in China, in Southeast Asia, in Thailand, some small extent in India. In other words, Japanese manufacturing is still done by Japanese companies. Ambassador Zumwalt tells the great story about the iPhone, that the content of the iPhone that's, quote, shipped from China to the United States, it's counted as a U.S.-China trade, has more Japanese value in it than Chinese value in it. So I don't think we should measure manufacturing only in terms of where it's located. And manufacturing is still an important part of overall Japanese private sector. Financial services, I have 2 points that I should have mentioned but didn't in terms of all the data and statistics. Japan is still, on an annual basis, it changes, right, a little bit, but roughly second or third largest holder of American treasury debt. In other words, Japanese purchase of American debt is a key financer of American consumption. And Japan is also very important to American stock market and American portfolio investment, as well as the insurance sector. So these financial services is a big part of our relationship, not to mention the FDI in the manufacturing sector for autos and auto parts. Well, I don't know about better or worse handle. Certainly Japan has a perspective that's closely monitored and discussed amongst officials. And in the community I work, which is the academic think tank community, we have numerous dialogues with Japan about issues relating to China. And so I would say that this is probably the single biggest strategic challenge for the United States and Japan. And again, we're not going to share exactly the same perspectives or assessments, given the geographical, historical, and the way in which we engage. But clearly, both in the official channels and in the communities I work, which is the think tanks, the policy relevant academic, we pay very close attention to what Japan thinks about China. Japan is locked into a territorial dispute with China on the East China Sea over the islands. Japan is facing, remember, it doesn't only work one way. Our relations with China have impacts on Japan, and Japan's relations with China have impacts on us. For example, Prime Minister Abe has announced that they're looking at ways of potentially cooperating with China on infrastructure projects in the region. So there's a little bit of a give and take and elasticity between our positions, but since we are locked into an alliance, that alliance is the first and foremost way in which we approach China, even if we have slightly differing assessments of particular matters. Well, Japan has announced that it's very concerned about Huawei and is looking for ways to manage and restrict. Many other countries in Asia are not so concerned about Huawei. So Japan will be very interested in technology protection, digital protection, communications protection. And it'll be very critical for our allies, because how we communicate in that country, if it's an alliance partner, depends on the communication system. And if that communication system is seen as permeable or can be violated, then it's going to be very difficult, particularly in the military and technology sphere, to work with that country. And by the way, this is a concern that's being discussed in Europe, it's being discussed in South and Latin America. Again, it's nothing unique to the U.S.-Japan relationship, but I see very little disagreement between the U.S. and Japan on the concerns about Huawei and technology in general in the future, including intellectual property theft by China. I see very little distinction between our positions and concerns.
Join me in thanking Dr. Limaye.